And our panelists are joining us today to give us an overview of legislative advocacy, how the process works, how they identify issues, how their organization incorporates legislative advocacy into their day-to-day work, and how we can do the same. In addition, how we can involve affected populations and the community behind issues that are important to us and that affect our client base. So I'm pleased to introduce our panel. To my left is Sam Tuttle from the Heartland Alliance, Kadeen Bennett from the ACLU, Dan Lesner from the Schreiber Center, and Colette Payne from Convening Legal Aid. And then after our panel discussion, our own Beth Johnson will give us a legislative update. Please remember to check in for CLE credit, and there are some snacks outside next to us and brought cookies to share. Thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me? I'm trying to speak with my diaphragm, but sometimes I run out of breath. Be a little nervous. So I did want to point out a couple things before we get going, and you hear from our legislative experts here. I did want to point out a couple of things in the packet for folks to look through. And certainly looking at it while we're talking might surface some questions. The first thing is there's a how a bill becomes a law in Illinois. This is the 2-second version. There's either a 2-second version or a 12-hour version. And so just know there's a lot that is not in this document, but the basics. For those of you who don't remember the cartoon. A bill is drafted, it's introduced. In Illinois, it has to go through committee in the first chamber of substantive committee, pass out of that committee, be voted on the floor, then it will move into a second chamber, the House or the Senate, go through substantive committee, voted on the floor, and sent to the governor. But also in Illinois, there are these things called first reading, second reading, third reading. It doesn't fully align with that committee process, but if you take a look at the chart, you'll get a sense of what happens during each of these stages in the process. That's literally kind of the calendar that each piece of legislation is on. I will do my best as we go through here to try to stop our experts when they start using inside language, but sometimes I forget. So if you can all commit to put your hand up if you don't understand something that somebody said. Because we do like to use a secret code for those of us who work in Springfield a lot, and sometimes we don't even know it's secret. The other piece is there's a sheet from Boulder Advocacy. I'm starting my gingerbread latte with my life. And so Alliance for Justice in DC has a project called Boulder Advocacy. Boulder Advocacy is aimed at helping nonprofits advocate. So lobby where they can, get involved in ballot initiatives. It also helps guide folks what is electioneering, which is not allowed by a C3, and what isn't. How to create a C4 if you want to have a more political organization. And so some basic guides are here in your packet, but also the website is awesome, and you can talk to an attorney on call that same day. So if you are facing something, call them. They're really great. And with that, I want to start out with our panel and ask each panelist, Kadeen, Dan, and Colette, let's just go in that order, how legislative advocacy is incorporated into your work and what it looks like. Or into your organization's work, excuse me.
Hi everyone, how are you?
Good.
So just so I know, get a sense of who's in the room, how many of you have been to Springfield to do issue advocacy? How many of those people have enjoyed it? That hurts. Well, hopefully after this time together, you will want to come and you'll enjoy it immensely. So I work at the ACLU of Illinois, and we take an integrated advocacy approach in our work. So we have a legal department, we have a legislative/advocacy department, we have a communications department, we have development and administration. So we believe that we need all of these people to come together in order for us to be successful. So when we think about legislation, it comes in 3 ways. One, our legal team, a project they may have an issue that they've been trying to work on, and litigation either isn't working, is too slow, or there's a threat that if you use litigation, you can create bad law. So then it may end up coming to my department and we figure out is there a legislative opportunity. It may come from something that we're hearing on the both legal or legislative side about we're part of coalitions and there's a problem that we've been hearing often that keeps popping up, and we think there's an opportunity to use legislation there. Or it could be fixing bad laws or laws that we've got passed, they've been in effect for a while, they're not working very well, so it's an opportunity to tweak those. I think it's one of the things I appreciate about our organization is the value of and understanding that we need all of these people, so legal and legislation, in order for us to be as effective as possible. I work on a variety of issues, so almost all the issues that we deal with, from First Amendment, reproductive rights, women's rights, criminal justice, policing, so it's a pretty wide scope of work, but I have the luxury of having legal projects who have specialized expertise. So they're really helpful whenever we need an issue expert to come down to Springfield, or if we need help drafting legislation. So it's a pretty good partnership generally.
Awesome. Dan?
Thanks. So I guess this gets into a little bit of history. The Shriver Center is composed of some attorneys who left Legal Assistance Foundation in 1996 at a time when the restrictions went into effect, and legal services attorneys could no longer do class action litigation or legislative or administrative advocacy or work on welfare reform. And there were 5 of us that basically defined what we did. That was the job description for what we did. And so we had no choice but to leave LAF and to join an existing organization. We've gone through some name changes. Stay tuned. We're going through another one, which we'll hear about next, right? Plus having a new president. I don't know how many of you saw John Bowman announce his retirement yesterday. But he'll be shuddering in the audience. But he'll be
You're like bomb dropping.
What?
You're like bomb dropping.
Yeah, sorry about that. So anyways, that was sort of defined what we did, and so it's sort of always been in our, like our DNA since we left LA many years ago to do those things that direct service legal services programs can't do, and that means legislative advocacy, administrative advocacy particularly, and impact litigation. Now, one thing we've learned, I guess I'll mention, is over the years, is that it's really hard to do both legislation and for the same person. I mean, you do legislation and impact litigation. You can't control litigation schedule, and if you're really into it with legislation, you certainly can't control that schedule for the 4 months or so that the legislature's in session. So we kind of divided up within the Shriver Center. We don't have the same.
You pull it even closer.
Yeah, sorry. We don't have the same lines of authority as the ACLU or the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless that have particular law projects and policy projects. But in effect, we kind of operate the same way. Should I talk about how we decide what to work on?
I mean, I was going to ask you later, but you can go for it.
I think you kind of opened the door to that.
Yeah.
So.
Why don't you go for it?
All right. Thank you, Sam.
Mess up my whole schedule thing.
Anyways, so legislation for us, it's an opportunity. It's really a way for us to both be community-driven in what we do, advancing our mission, and also advancing our mission to promote race equity. So when we're deciding what legislative projects to take on, those are criteria we apply. Now, they're fairly new criteria. We're still learning our way, but they're very much at the forefront of our decision-making now. Now, to give you a couple of quick examples of where legislation we've done recently that was really community-driven. One is the school resource officer bill that was passed and signed into law last year. And that came from community telling us that there were a lot of abuses by police in schools. They weren't trained. Situations escalated needlessly. And so Michelle Vecchiani-Wiley at the Shriver Center took on this issue, became an expert, and passed important legislation that provides for comprehensive training of school resource officers. The second piece of legislation that we and our coalition partners in the immigrant community is the Immigrant Tenant Protection Act. And that came out of learning from the community that there were landlords who were, big surprise, exerting leverage over their tenants based on the tenant's immigration status. And so it prohibited them from disclosing or threatening to disclose immigration status to get out of, to keep security deposits, get out of making repairs, that kind of thing. So those Now, there are a whole lot of other ways that we learn about issues that we wind up pursuing legislatively. Talking to service providers, we all work with a lot of service providers, including legal services providers, but also a lot of other kinds of service providers. Coalition partners. We hear from our coalition partners about issues that they've uncovered that we find very interesting, and we wind up working together. There's some things we do that that are just obviously community driven. Last year, for example, we had a bill to increase the temporary assistance for needy families, cash assistance grant. And we didn't really meet people in the community to tell us this would be a good thing, but nevertheless we did. The community was very involved in this legislation. First by one of our partners, the CCH, assembled a focus group of TANF recipients, and they didn't really tell us anything. I mean, we talked amongst ourselves, the advocates, about what would people use the TANF grant for, an increase in TANF grant, rent, anything other than food, rent, utilities, clothing, diapers, so on, personal hygiene products, clothing. And that was the same thing they told us, but it was more powerful when we talked to legislators to be able to say, we've spoken with recipients, and this is what they said they would use the extra funding for, as opposed to, in our opinion, this is what they use the funding for. So, and also identifying a witness who can speak and really represent that population, I think was another thing. I mean, it's good strategy, but it's also just a good way to get community involvement. We have networks. Another way that we come up with ideas is that we network a lot with other states, so we hear about good things that they've done in other states that we can pursue here. And then the last thing, and this may become more prevalent, is the implementation of new federal laws or to fill gaps that are created by the federal retreat in things like civil rights enforcement. So I think that's an overview of how we come up with issues.
Thanks. And I did want to just add to what Dan was saying about kind of engaging with folks as a part of the legislative process as well. With the TANF increase, if the advocates may not have felt like there was something particularly obvious, I think that most of us have experience, and I think particularly lawyers tend to think they know everything, that when we actually play this out with individuals who have more going on in their lives than their legal case, we find that our solution isn't necessarily the perfect fit. Or in negotiations where we think we're going is not where we want to go. Certainly, Beth Collette and I have seen that in a lot of our criminal justice reform. And so I do think one of the kind of skills, and we'll talk about this more, is making sure that we're all checking ourselves as a part of making law. Collette, will you talk a little bit about CGLA's work and how legislative advocacy fits in?
Yes, I'm glad you repeated the question because of all that wonderful information I forgot. So, at CGLA, I'm the community organizer there. My name is Colette Payne, and I work with a wonderful team of lawyers who work on housing issues, family issues. So how legislative work plays out as being a community organizer, I think is great because I get an opportunity to go inside the business. So with that, I'm identifying issues from talking to the women, right? And as being a formerly incarcerated woman myself, right? So while talking with them, I'm able to identify issues such as what it's like to give birth while incarcerated, how they're being treated, are they getting enough food to eat? And out of doing interviews, we passed a great piece of legislation, HB 3904, which created a permanent women's division in IDOC, right? So that's one way. And, my focus is primarily on women and girls, but of course, I'm for everybody who's been incarcerated. So working with barriers to employment with our coalition partners, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, CRS, and Heartland Alliance, we passed a lot of great legislation. And the folks that I work with are directly impacted, right? So we're leading the way. We're sitting down at a table and we're figuring out what it is that we want to work on. And the lawyers and the advocates, the policy team, help us figure that out and write the legislation.
Great. So, Kadeen, I'm curious, I certainly have opinions about this too, but what do you wish practicing attorneys knew about Springfield and the legislative process?
Yeah, so I have a little bullet point list of things. The first is that yeah, these are good, happy piece. It's not always a clean, linear process, and I think as attorneys sometimes you prefer that, and it's like, you know, I give you this perfect. Okay, I gave you this perfect bill, and then you're calling me about amendments, negotiations, and why is that possible? I gave you great arguments, and you know, you said it was going to happen in one session, and it's been 3 sessions. So it's a moving process. It depends on a lot of people outside of our control. No matter how much we plan, there are things that are out of our control. So let's say one of you says, Keen, I really want to be an issue expert on an issue. I say, we have a hearing that's happening on Wednesday at 4 o'clock. There are many times with our lawyers where they come down for a 4 o'clock hearing and it ends up being a 6 o'clock hearing. Or something happens and it's canceled. So those are things outside of our control. I think of when we were working on marriage equality, we had all of our plaintiffs and our witnesses come down with their families. It was a 12 o'clock hearing. At 6 o'clock, we had to order pizza because we had no idea what was happening, the timing. So things outside of our control. It can be frustratingly incremental. So especially if you have this thing where it's like, the community wants it, there's a clear need, we have all of this information, why can't we have the whole piece of what we want? One of my first bills around that was around sex ed. So sex ed in schools, comprehensive sex ed, and I developed a perfect bill. It was going to be amazing. It was fantastic, best practices. And I was like, this is going to be a no-brainer. And then I ended up with, I describe it as going from like a fully loaded car to like a used car, like a Yugo. Like it was just like so bare bones. It's like an abstinence plus kind of bill. But even though we didn't get exactly what it is we want, there's still opportunity for us to eventually get to where we want to be. Good arguments don't always win. I was working with some friends who are lawyers around this bill, and they were saying it was a penalty enhancement bill, a penalty enhancement. And we'd have these phone calls where they were my Chicago experts, and I was the Springfield person. And they would say, and I was telling them, you know, we're not getting traction, this bill is still moving. They're like, did you try this argument? I was like, yeah, I did. They're like, did you try this? We gave you all of these documents. Are you sure you're making the good arguments? So I was like, why don't you come down? And so they came down. And then at the end of the day, they're like, so it doesn't really matter what arguments you make. It's actually beyond that. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. Related to that, data and legal arguments can be really great. And as the ACLU, to be able to say this is unconstitutional, here's the information, that can be really, really compelling. But it can also be as compelling or sometimes more compelling to hear the stories. So what are the examples? Like what's the person behind the policy? And I think for some of you who are doing this work, you kind of know the person or how it can impact people in real ways. So keeping people at the center of the work is a really useful tool. The other thing is meeting people where they are. So I tell people that for us, we don't have permanent friends or enemies on issues because at some point, a legislator who is super anti-choice, super anti-LGBT can also be a championer on data privacy issues. So I think sometimes when people come in, they have this idea of like Representative X is the worst person ever, so I'm going to talk to them and be hostile, and then they end up meeting them at some point for something else. So even as advocates coming in and out of the process, I think meeting people where they are, treating them with respect is pretty important. I know that's probably a no-brainer, but it's always good to say. And I think it's not enough for us to highlight the problem. So if you're thinking, you know, this is a really bad system, this law is really bad, being solutions oriented and giving us concrete things that you want us to do. So sometimes with my legal staff, when they've highlighted things where something is problematic, even if we don't move legislation right now, even just getting like, what would be your alternative language or an alternative bill? Because even if it's not a 2019 bill, there could be an opportunity that we didn't realize that we had. And to have that information or a concrete solution is pretty useful. Let's see, anything else? If you have ideas around legislation and you want to talk to people who do advocacy work in Springfield, the summer and fall are your best times to reach out to us because that's the time where we're preparing for the next session. So if you come to us in January for something you want that session, it tends to make our life pretty insane. So if at all possible, that's useful, and we really appreciate issue experts. So I would hope that some of you, or all of you, would come down to Springfield at some point because while we're there all the time, we get used to it. So like, oh, it's gonna be from the ACLU. But when we come with somebody who actually does the work every day, and it's like, this is a lawyer who does this work from the fill in the blank organization or an advocate, it makes legislators pay special attention.
Yeah, we're pretty boring to legislators.
Oh, I'm not.
Everybody at the dean is pretty boring to legislators because they see us all the time, right? And they can tell us no today because they know they probably have some sort of yes for us tomorrow. But when experts come down on a specific issue, they don't know that they're going to see that person again, and so the pressure of saying no is different, right? They're sitting in that space differently. I think the other thing, so I spent years in legal services and then have spent the last 10 years as a lobbyist. And one of the things that I realized is when you are in litigation, your audience is different. You have the court, and you have the other party. Sometimes press is involved if you're doing something really exciting, but for the most part, you have a finite set of targets. That is not the case in Springfield. You have 118 targets in the House, you have 59 targets in the Senate, and then you have the politics surrounding it. Optics, campaigns, what's acceptable to constituents. You have opposition that can be 15 different groups with different interests coming in to talk to legislators about a bill. It becomes significantly less linear. And I think one of the challenges I had when I started is that I was approaching legislative work as a litigator. And so I understood the challenges. I would go into negotiations as if I was negotiating a case. And I was losing. And so it is a different skill set. We desperately need legal service attorneys in Springfield. I feel like there were issues, Angela and I worked on an issue this year where it was like, I just want somebody down here who knows the stuff because I don't know anymore. But we also want to partner with you to help kind of bring our skill set to yours. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of as a group are always working to negotiate, that they are two absolutely different skill sets, and we both kind of have the underlying ability to work on it, but it takes some time to learn both. And certainly I don't remember how to be in court anymore, so you guys need to teach me that. Dan, do you have any reflections on this, what you wish people knew?
I mean, every day there are things that happen here in Springfield, and I wish I knew they were coming. I wish I knew what they meant. That's part of the fun of doing this. It's very unpredictable. And I guess some of the other differences, there is no finder of fact. Like in court, there are basically no rules. There are rules, but virtually any rule can be broken. And I'm sure Devine and Sam and Colette have seen everything other than the Illinois Constitution be broken when necessary to reach a desired result of someone who's got power. So I think Sam gave a real good summary of what it's meaning of what it's. I guess I don't know if this is the right time to say this, but I think you need to partner. There's so many things that go on in Springfield on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of what we see, a lot of what any of us can see, such as what happens in committee, what happens on the floor, a lot of that is entertainment or performance art. It's not where the decisions get made. The decisions are all made behind the scenes before they come out and face the public. And so you really, and we can talk about this more, but there are just a whole long list of things that you need to partner with you. So unless you're able to be down there on a very regular kind of weekly or bi-weekly basis, that you're going to need to find a partner. I think it's great advice to start floating your ideas in the spring or in the summer and the fall, because once January hits, people who are in Springfield are just going to be too busy to really be able to partner and take something on.
Colette, I think you have, you are not a lawyer, and so for the lawyers in the room, as somebody who's in Springfield and has to hang out with way too many lawyers, what do you wish folks knew about Springfield advocacy?
I don't know. It's a whole lot I wish I didn't know. But I don't. It's a process, and I had to learn that it's almost like a waiting game. A lot of talking, a lot of standing, of course. When you get down there, you just really have to be prepared to have conversations. And, you know, sometimes you may not be happy with what's being said by the legislators, but like Kadeen said, being as polite as possible, knowing what you're saying, and, you know, most of all, taking folks with you who've been impacted, who can speak to their own experience, you know, whatever it is that you're working on. Because I think those folks who have been impacted, even though you all are lawyers, they have that true, authentic experience.
So following up on that, Colette, so Colette worked on legislation with a number of us that really rolled back some collateral consequences, including for people with murder convictions to work in healthcare. This is a highly controversial issue, and it took a lot of conversations with folks who are impacted. And I'm wondering if you can kind of share what that looked like and kind of any aha moments legislators had talking to leaders.
You know, legislators, sometimes they just don't know. They need to be educated on issues and how these issues are impacting families and affecting communities, right? So we're there to educate them. But, you know, that was a really long process. I think it took like over 2 years, and it took the advocates, it took for us to go down there every week, spending the night on the ground running for the next day. And a lot of negotiating that was really hard, especially for the folks that have been impacted. Because, you know, we had our mind set on one thing and then they took it down a notch, right? So, say we wanted 5 years, they took it up to maybe 7. I can't remember what it exactly was, but that was heartbreaking for our leaders, and for those who didn't go down, to bring them this news. They're like, oh my God, why? You know, we need to do it this way. But as Kadeen said, you know, you're doing things in incremental, and you can always go back later. But yeah, it's a process.
Kadeen, can you share kind of how the resources it takes to pass a bill, what sort of time investment in shepherding a bill, and also the role that, because I think this is something that's really hard from far away, is the role that timelines and changing timelines can play in how a bill moves.
Yeah, I think it depends on the bill and the issue, and sometimes the things you think will take a really long time ends up going really fast, and the thing that you think will take a short time does not. So I think in terms of resources, I think it's a lot of prepping. So even the drafting of the legislation, doing the research to figure out what's happening in other states, making sure if possible and highly encouraged to get the perspective of folks who are most impacted by the issue. Once you have the language that you want, being able to find the right sponsor and identify the right person who can carry that message. So and identify that for the particular issue, the sponsor who would be the best sponsor. Is it somebody who's in leadership? Is it somebody who you know will actively work a bill because it's going to be really difficult? Is it somebody who's really good in negotiations because you can work the bill, but you need somebody who's going to stand strong? And then developing the right material. So not just fact sheets, and memos are great. And our attorneys love to draft memos, but also going from a memo to something that's like a fact sheet, where it's something quick and bite-sized for legislators to pay attention to. And I've come to realize I've been lobbying for 8 years now, and they read less. So now it's almost like they want a little, like, I feel like in 2 years we'll get to like a picture with like some kind of name, like this is what I want to do. And now they're moving to color, so we have to like also be like both like information givers and also graphic designers at the same time. And then there's a lot of time spent doing education on the issue with staff people, helping them draft their analysis. So for both chambers, both parties, there are staffers who do analysis on bills. So the time to develop a relationship with them so you can give them your analysis so they have some of that information available. And then legislator education. And for some people, it could mean one conversation where it's a yes or no. There was one legislator who's a lawyer, well, not me, where when I first started, it almost became a game, where it was a bill that ended up being like 2 years, and we had a good conversation, gave them a fact sheet, and said, okay, I'll circle back with you next week. So next week came, and I was like, hey, just wanted to see where you're on this bill, and it's not a difficult bill. And they're like, oh, I have to read the fact sheet. I was like, okay. So like it became this routine where every week I was like, okay, it's Wednesday. Let me find him. I know what he's going to say. But that kind of like, you know, and it's one of those things where you have a roll call, you need to get to a certain number of votes. So making sure that legislators are educated and also getting them to answer the question. And then even after you get a bill out of both chambers, it's also educating the governor's staff, making sure they understand what the bill does. And in all of that, you also want to make sure, depending on the issue, that you're contacting media people so you can get the information to a broader audience, you're connecting to your membership. So it's a lot of work and time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that, so I, for one more day, lead a team of 5 lobbyists. And one of the things that when I train my advocates is I'm like, it's the 30-second rule. You have 30 seconds to talk to a legislator. And if their face is saying continue to engage, you can keep talking. But if they're turning off, you are done. And so, you know, you don't have the full argument, and also you have to be really cautious that what you are doing is convincing people in a hallway. I have this challenge that I feel like sometimes this is a very skilled profession, and sometimes I realize I'm literally just chasing people through the hall. You know, there's a lot of dignity in that. But I think the other thing is to know that, to Dan was talking about how the rules can change, is that at certain times of the year, things can drop with very little notice. Amendments can go to committee on 1 hour notice. So if you are a subject matter expert, working with folks in Springfield, and you get a call and they're like, I need to talk to you now, they are serious. They are not being disrespectful. They are saying this bill moves or doesn't move in an hour, and I need to know what you think, or what you think is not going to matter. And so that I think is one of the things that is really tough in partnership, especially, as Dan said, with folks in litigation. There was a time when I was in litigation and in Springfield, and that was really not sustainable, because those two different structures are so defined by having to show up at a given time and are a little bit unforgiving, and those challenges can be the same. So just as you're developing partnerships, and I think we want to encourage everybody to develop partnerships with folks who have a Springfield presence, and they can help you build out the advocacy that your organization does. Also think through how you're going to kind of share the work. There was a moment in time when Beth couldn't be in Springfield as much, and so she was literally, we would have 6 a.m. meetings, and she would be preparing things because she could be at a computer when I couldn't to get something done that day. I did want to see,
I think what's helpful and what we do with our lawyers in terms of drafting is tell me your ideal and then tell me your non-negotiables, because that helps in terms of if it's like at the end of session, you don't have time, I don't have time. If I already know your things of like, I must have this no matter what, or don't move a bill, or these are the things that are aspirational and it would be great, and these are the mid-level things, to be able to identify that on the front end can be really helpful.
I want to make sure, do folks have any questions? Oh, come on, guys. Okay, yeah, what's your question?
What strategies do you use on the second time around? So say session comes and goes, not successful. What do you take into account when you go back? And there will be tweaks, but what type of strategy?
So one example that comes to mind is that sex ed bill. So the first year, it was a bill that was run by the ACLU and Planned Parenthood-led coalition. And people would have these conversations about we're teaching kids about how to have sex, like things that had nothing to do with the legislation. And that's what, as we were then, I realized, okay, so the arguments don't matter. It's about what the other side is saying. So the second time around, we actually had public health departments take the lead. So we were involved in like talking to legislators, but when we were in committee hearings, they were the ones who reframed it as a public health issue, gave stats to legislators about what was happening in their districts. So that would be a tweak that ended up being successful.
Other questions?
Okay.
Rich?
So I know nothing about this process, and I'm not supposed to know. But what are the myths and the truths about the role of Mike Madigan in this whole process? Is that someone who knows nothing, that's all
Dan.
everything?
Well, let me just,
And Dan, remember we're being recorded?
Tiffany gave some good examples of what you want to look for in a sponsor. You also want a sponsor who has a good relationship with Michael Madigan, all right? So your bill doesn't get buried. And to a certain extent, that's true in the Senate as well. So that's one of your considerations. There's so many things that happen in the legislative process. We could get in the weeds about our job, but there's so many things that happen. One way I think to think about it is you have this bill, and maybe it gets stripped down like Dean was talking about, but the idea is to move it all the way through the process, and Sam's giving you the schematics on that, but you've got to get it through the first house, you've got to get it through the second house, you've got to get the governor to sign it, or you've got to, if the governor vetoes it, you've got to override his veto. Where's it going with this?
Like that.
So there are a lot of ways, there's a lot of steps in between all of those. There's many, many steps in between those. And you're trying to avoid having your bill get stuck. And there's so many ways to stick your bill, and there's so many ways to do it without leaving fingerprints on it. You don't really know who did it, why they did it. So, and particularly with leadership, they can assign, just for example, they can assign your bill to a committee, to a bad committee, or a committee that never meets. They can leave your bill in the Rules Committee and not even assign it out to the committee. They can change the members of the committee. The leaders have the absolute power to remove committee members at any, on a temporary basis and substitute for them. So say they've got a member who they want the result, but they don't want this particular member on the committee to have to vote to achieve that result, and put a different member on who is politically safe for them. And these are just a few things that get done. I will say about Speaker Madigan, I think that he's been so successful in large part because he really knows what his members kind of need. I mean, it serves his purpose because he wants to have a majority to be elected speaker. But it also just serves his overall goal of what he can accomplish in Springfield by understanding his members and not asking them to do things that are going to jeopardize their reelection. Now, another inside thing that he does is that there are targets who are members who have just been elected. Usually it's just elected or in swing districts, and he will prohibit his targets from voting in favor of anything that's controversial that's going to hurt them. And normally the number of targets is such that you need Republican votes to pass anything controversial. Now, I don't know that that's going to be true. None of us have been through a session with such domination by the Democrats as we see now with the governor and the General Assembly, not just the House and Senate, but a super majority in the House and Senate, which means they can do things like amend the Constitution to provide for a fair tax instead of a flat income tax. So none of us, I don't think, have experience where there's just such overwhelming control by one party. And I do think it's really hard to read the tea leaves, but it does appear to me at least that the speaker and the governor-elect are going to work together closely. And if the governor-electing gets someone who's such a master in legislative, how to get things done in the legislature, and no one knows how to do that better than Speaker Madigan, if they can work together, it's pretty amazing some of the things that might be accomplished.
Colette or Kadeem, do you have any thoughts?
So when Dan was explaining the ways that leadership could put your bill in a committee that it may never get out of, the flip side is possible too. So sometimes it works to the advantage of issues you care about, where they either pop it out of committees that are problematic, or they, for things that are issues that we'd rather not see the light of day, those rules could benefit us as well. So it's not a purely bad or good thing. It's a reality, and when it works in your favor, that's amazing, and when it doesn't, it is not so amazing.
So I will add to that. So I'm just thinking of a bill that Beth, Colette, and I worked on, where I think there were maybe 12 members of the committee, and we arranged for 6 subs. And so it, once that game is kind of laid out, learning to manage it is important. I think the other thing is the more time you spend in Springfield, the more you can almost smell things going wrong before they happen. And this is where you can see kind of the influence of kind of leadership and politics, where I feel like I should have been on the rules committee by now. Or I feel like something should have happened by now. And there are ways to dig it down. As much as I think the image of leadership in Springfield is that there's this kind of master plan and it's completely opaque, and it's true, I can never guess what the speaker is thinking. It's also an extremely accessible place. You can ask a lot of questions. You can talk to a lot of staff. Each committee has a bunch of staff who are counting votes, and they're going to tell you how many votes you have. And so there are lots of mysteries you can solve if you can actually do the legwork. So I think kind of the newspaper impression of how it works and the realities of kind of being able to manage in that system are different. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned the press, and I think you've also mentioned about the press and when you think it's appropriate and you have a particular issue. How long do you think the press covers Springfield in terms of behind-the-scenes activities and getting to the reality of what's going on?
I think not as good as it did back in the day, in part because a lot of the Springfield Bureau people are no longer there. So there aren't as many reporters who are covering everyday activities. They're mostly there for something big that's happening, but in terms of everyday having kind of like beat reporters, and that's a reflection of journalism generally, right? So there are less journalists that exist. So, but I think that's why we try our best to get press attention to issues and develop relationships with press people who have interest in the issues. But there's so many things that happen, and I don't know if you all have ever been on the General Assembly website, www.ilga.gov. So you can go there and figure out the schedules. And I would invite you, when you're working hard, have it on your computer. You can, when the House or Senate is in, you can listen and watch floor debates. And it is so incredible what is said on the floor that people have no idea. So some of like the most horrific things, some really great things, and sometimes I come back to Chicago and I talk to my partner, I'm like, hey, James, did you hear what happened? And he's like, no. I'm like, how could you not hear that fill in the blank happens? And I think part of our job should be to follow those things, even if it's just noise in the background, but to listen to what the people who make laws that affect your lives are saying, the perspectives they have, and then it's an accountability mechanism. So let's say an issue that you care about, that you work on, and you hear someone saying something that's just over the top, that's an opportunity for you all to engage. And could be a letter, could be a visit, it could be a phone call. And it also helps them to know that people are watching, and it's not just the lobbyists who are watching, it's people who have expertise in the area.
Yeah. Was there a question over here? Or was that over where am I at?
It's a procedural question about we're switching governors. What happens to bills that went through the November veto sessions if the current governor doesn't do anything with them?
You mean that passed?
Yes. So yes, and particularly what this would care about is the fees and fines bill that changes the civil fee waiver structure. The trailer bill to the big bill that happened before.
Dean, do you want to answer this, respect? I mean, my understanding is, right, if the governor doesn't sign a bill after 60 days, it becomes law. I think that depending on what the current governor wants to do, right, there are statements to be made with vetoes. You can't override something at this point, for the most part, unless he managed to veto it right before, we're going back for 2 days, January 8th and 9th, or 7th and 8th. So that does depend. I think there is advocacy to happen with the governor's office. It depends. Steve Anderson is not the governor's friend, and he's the face of the bill, right? Because of the budget showdown. And so kind of figuring out if there's a way to communicate with governor's staff about, can you just pretend this bill isn't there so it becomes law, might be the better way to do it. Or within those 60 days, then you might have a new governor who can sign it.
Has the bill been sent to the governor?
Would it?
Because they have ways of not sending to the governor.
Well, and just to say, I think the trailer bill, I mean, we don't anticipate any issues with the governor signing the trailer bill. He was supportive of the original bill, so, and the trailer bill is exclusively technical changes, so I think we'll be fine. But yeah.
Kadeen disagrees with me on procedure, so apparently the governor can't sign it. She's always right.
No, I'm not allowed to. I think you'd have to do a procedural move to stop the bill, like to stop the clock on the bill for it to then, in a new General Assembly, there's like, procedurally, there's a way that a new governor can sign it. Generally speaking, unless you do that move, the bill would die with this new General Assembly. So normally there are 2 years of a General Assembly. We're now going from the 100th to the 101. So if the governor doesn't take action and it's before the time where it automatically becomes a bill, the law, then it dies and you restart for Canada. But as Angela said, your bill is fine, so.
Other questions? Yeah.
Something that Kadeen said about like allies and finding allies in unlikely places, I think sometimes, or the flip side of that, something that I was thinking about as we talked about was how do you deal with it if a legislator that you really like or a group that you really like is promoting something that you have concerns about?
Yeah, I'm going to call on Kadeen again. Do you want to talk about a couple of years ago, one of our best friends had a bill we really didn't like, and what that felt like, and then Dan and Colette, if you've had that experience as well.
So this representative is like our champion on bills. Like if we will probably name an award after them because they're just so good. And they told us about a bill around mandated reporting, and we were pretty opposed to it as a concept. So we did our due diligence, went to the representative and said, hey, ACLU, your friend, we're telling you this is problematic and here are all of the reasons. And there was an advocate who felt very strongly about it on the other side. And they listened and I said, I don't want to oppose the bill or try to kill your bill, but if you try to move it, courtesy, letting you know that we will try to kill it. And they're like, okay, well, I hear you, and I will move my bill. And so that was a very uncomfortable moment, but at the same time, it's my job to kill bad bills. And for that moment, when I said earlier, there were no permanent friends or enemies, then we were frenemies. And then building a strong coalition that actively worked to oppose it. We used some of those things where we talked to a committee chair to try to keep it in that committee, like all of the things that we could use at our disposal to kill that bill, and we were successful, so that's exciting. And I think for that relationship, for that moment, it was not a very pleasant bill. I'm glad we didn't have any other bills that they were our main sponsor of, because that would have been uncomfortable. But it's just something that you do, because at the end of the day, our client, I say, is the Constitution, and if we feel really strongly about it, no relationship that we have with a legislator will ever impact that. And I think legislators know. They know that at the end of the day, we will fight till the death for something good or bad.
And you can be honest with legislators. Kadeen and I, for years, have been working on legislation where the House sponsor is a conservative Republican sponsor who frequently is not on board with some of our other issues. And this representative will bring up all these bill ideas with me, and I will say, well, if you introduce that bill, I'll have to oppose it. And you can just be honest, because to a certain extent, if you are in the building and everybody knows what you're about, being what you're about is the most important thing, rather than trying to kind of meet somebody or meet some other sort of advocate. Dan or Colette, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, just to build on that immediate comment about being honest about things, the worst thing you can be is not honest about something, because you will lose that legislator forever, and for good reason. But we like to joke about the legislators having a short attention span and so on, but they do have to deal with like 500 issues at a time, and so they do rely on you for information. So any information you provide has got to be totally accurate, no matter where they fall on the spectrum. I just wanted to mention a couple other things that are sort of germane to I think what we were talking about. One is the idea of ASKS. You always have an ask when you talk to a legislator, or virtually always have an ask when you talk to a legislator, because I see Kadeen frowning at me.
No, that's
Do you agree with
no.
So well, good. So you always have an ask, and someone who's a supporter, you might ask, will you support the bill? Will you be a co-sponsor of the bill? Will you speak up on the floor for it? Will you speak for it in caucus? Caucus is where the Republicans meet together or the Democrats meet together. That's kind of where the decisions get made. So you have a series of asks, and just the same with an opponent. Okay, will you not speak on the floor in opposition to this? Will you not lobby your colleagues to oppose it? Will you stay quiet in caucus? And it's amazing how you will get agreement from them to do those things, and they can really make a difference. We had a bill a couple of years ago that we lost by just a few votes, maybe 2 or 3 votes, and your sponsor can move to, what's it called? Move to reconsider?
Postpone consideration.
Move to postpone consideration. So if there were sufficient number of votes for the bill, they can move for postpone consideration and bring the bill back. So that's what our sponsor did, and then we identified about half a dozen members who we thought would be gettable if the bill was called again. We said, we'll take these 2, sponsor will take these 2, like that, people we thought we could get. We went to meet with one of the leaders, one of the Republican leaders who had spoken against the bill on the floor. And he said, it was with someone from American Alliance, and he said, we're explaining to him, and he's just kind of shaking his head. And at some point he said, I really still don't understand this bill. I'm sorry, sometimes the partisan juices get flowing when I'm out there on the floor. But I've done pro bono work with American Alliance. I value that relationship. So here's what I can do. I can't vote for your bill, but I will talk to some of the loudmouths in the caucus and just tell them we're not going to have debate on it when it goes back to the floor. We're just going to take a vote, and we knew we had the votes. That was a huge, that was as much as anyone did for us to pass that bill. And it's totally not, well, now it's public, but it was totally public before I just told the story. There's no fingerprints. There's nothing that would tie it to supporting the bill.
I know who it is.
So, what's that?
I said, I know who it is.
Yeah, well, no one does that example. But anyways, it just is an example of, and I'm sure these guys have done things like this, 100 times, where there's just this continuum of things you can ask for, or they think of on their own. We've talked to the most right-wing, welfare-hating people, and just giving them a chance to vent for 15 minutes before the committee can be a way of getting them to calm down and not be so aggressive. So there's all kinds of nuances and gradations to how members can fall, wind up on something after you've got a chance to speak to them.
Claude has no other questions?
I have time for one or two more questions.
Yes.
So, I've worked on legislation where, what's been the most important has been the position of the department that I'm dealing with, and, trying to, just even get time sometimes with those people, and then getting them to have a position that is supported by their director has been, at times, an issue, so, and the other thing that's come up, and I just wanted you to comment on, like, having to work inside departments, on legislation, because they seem to have a great deal of power over the process.
Yeah, I
What was
wonder,
the last thing you said?
work inside state departments.
The various state departments, I know you guys have a good relationship, but if you don't on a bill, then you're sort of, in a way, stuck and can't,
And I'm wondering if you guys can just talk about the different types of kind of power in Springfield, so where the kind of state agencies have power and how that's different sometimes than when your opposition might be someone else, like the retail merchants.
Right, yeah. So that's probably the biggest difference is, do you have a bill that has some sort of financial interest implicated in it? And if so, you can expect you're going to have a hard time, because chances are they have made, campaign contributions are a source of that. Other reasons, but that's probably the main one. So, whereas with the state agencies, they all, of course, work for the governor. So if they are opposed to your bill, that means, or usually means, that the governor will veto your bill if it gets to him. And it's hard to get the 3/5 supermajority. So you do have to certainly work with the state agencies, try to bring them around. They all have legislative liaisons, but the liaisons actually work for the governor. They don't work for the agency itself. But they all have liaisons. We all know our liaisons. I work on human services issues, so the DHS liaisons are the ones I know best. Occasionally they come in contact with others, but they're actually around. They're pretty accessible. It's not real hard to talk to them. We've had I could think of 2 instances where we've gone over their heads and gotten the secretary to reverse their position that the department has taken in opposition, moving to neutral, or neutral, moving to support. So I don't want to say it's easier than when you're dealing with private interest, but I think it probably is. And there's all kinds of dynamics, between the people in the department who may have different ideas about things. So there's their internal dynamics, and then there's the legislative liaison who they tend to defer to. So, and the liaison is going to be friendlier to you because you're a fellow lobbyist than probably other people in the state agency. And people at the state agency are going to listen to them because it's their area of expertise. So it's certainly very worthwhile to have a good relationship. And to, it's one of the things you do down there. You see them every day or every other day, and you give them a big handshake, and you talk about them for a couple minutes. They are very important. And yeah.
Colette, I'm wondering, just kind of while we're talking about agencies, if you could talk about the work you do in terms of the implementation, especially with the legislation that's been moved, and how that works, because so much of what agencies do is really put things into action, generally with both Rocky bills and other legislation.
Yeah. Well, I can say when we passed our the ceiling expansion bill, HB 2373, of course we, when we go down and we do a number of summits partnering with other jurisdictions, right? Bringing the summits to their community. And in doing that, we came across, about preparing the necessary paperwork, the little dockets. I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, so how you fill out for the ceiling, those forms, whatever they're called. But it was interesting because we're sitting there and we're seeing some of the things, the ordinances that people are being fined with. So that's how we came up with fines and fees. And it was just simply ridiculous to see that in communities, like singing in a public parkway, or having your music too loud, not having your dogs spaded or neutered. And I was like, okay, this is something that we have to work on. Why should a person be fined for this, right?
Colette, could you back up and tell everybody what the ceiling bill is?
So the ceiling in Illinois, before we passed this bill, there were only 9 felonies that were eligible for ceiling, right? So once we got the bill passed, everything became eligible except DUIs, domestic violence, animal cruelty, and sexual assault, right? So when we're going down to these other jurisdictions, people were being denied to get their records sealed because they had outstanding fines and fees, and this was a huge problem. So that's what we started to work on. So implementation is important, and even when you're passing a bill, you have to constantly monitor if people are doing what they say they are going to do. What is the law? Are you implementing the law? So we have to constantly stay on top of them and monitor the bill.
And I actually think that's, for folks in this room, something that advocates aren't going to see, right? If I didn't work with Green Legal Aid, I would never know that the ceiling legislation we worked on was coming up with these problems. But the folks in this room would. And so I know Illinois Legal Aid Online and other places really talk about some of the more impactful legislation that's passed. To keep your eye on how that's working and try to use it helps all of us make sure we're getting it right, and frankly holding the feet to the fire for folks who probably were bad actors to begin with in some ways. Certainly we have some state's attorneys downstate who have continued to be bad actors. But I think that's all the time we have, right? Okay, with that Justin?
Okay, so we're talking about, thank you, everybody. I did want to. So talking about legislation, you might remember we were taking proposals for anything that the legal aid wanted to bring up to the CBA to sponsor for this legislative session. There wasn't a lot of topics brought up, but what we have done the last couple of years is work towards plain language. Remember changing the eviction statute, the name of it, And there's a couple more that we came up with that the subcommittee, the legislative subcommittee voted to bring it to the CBA for approval, the legislative committee, which they did just last week. So it's 2 more plain language statutes. And the 2 plain languages, we are working on a civil asset forfeiture, is one word, that's going to be changed to something like property taken during an arrest. Like something more plain language, right? As much as Bob Glaze wanted to work on McClellan, we actually decided to work on adanum. What is that? Adanum, is that how you say it? Who knows what that means? Nobody else does either. That's the whole point, right? So it's going to be changed from that word to amount claim, right? That's what it is. It's like the amount that you're saying is claim, right? And so those are 2 bills that will go through the full CBA, right? Because the legislative committee, the CBA legislative committee said, okay. Was it okay? The debate, they're open for that?
It was fine, yeah.
It was fine, according to Angela. And then now the whole CBA. And if that's true, then these 2 bills will be introduced in January, right? Identifying sponsors, the CBA lobbyist would be the one that's helping move that bill, because when they have supported legislation, they actually assign a lobbyist to it, which is really helpful. So that's our 2 plain language. And then there's also the one that was passed last year, the plain language task force. And so implementation efforts, right, is how do you keep that moving? Because who in this room does the most plain language stuff that you work with right now? Like, what would that be? The statewide forums committees, right? Like, the whole point is helping pro se's understand with Aleo, with Jill and Allison and their work at the, not commission. Commission? AOS. So yeah, these are the next 2, but the plain language task force, I'm sure people are going to be tapped on to help when appropriate in their subject matter areas, because the whole point is legislation is supposed to be run through this task force, right, to make sure it's plain, right, not like we're clever. Okay, so just an update on that, and we'll keep you updated as it goes on, and we get bill numbers and all that stuff after the new year, okay? Okay.